2:13 a.m. As I was running through the middle of the graves, my phone rang again. There was no number on the screen, just a single line of text. Don't turn around. I stopped because right at that moment, a very calm male voice came from right behind me. Daniel, you dropped something. I didn't look back, but the man knew my name, and I was completely alone in that cemetery in Savannah. Welcome to True Horror Vault. Hi everyone. I hope you're all doing well. Some places appear entirely normal in the light of day. Cemeteries are much like that. During the daytime, people come here, place flowers, clean old headstones, and offer prayers. But after night falls, the exact same place can completely transform. Darkness, silence, and human fear. When these three elements combine, our minds can see or hear things for which we cannot immediately find a logical explanation. Today's story is one of those occurrences. This is not a tale of a monster, nor is it a story about a supernatural spirit. Rather, it is a story of a person who, one night in an old American cemetery, saw something whose true explanation might be even more terrifying than ghosts. This is Daniel's story. Location, Savannah, Georgia. Time, late October. And in Daniel's own words, ever since that night, he has never entered another cemetery alone. Story 1. Among the Graves of Savannah. My name is Daniel Carter. I lived in Savannah, Georgia, for about 6 years. The city is old. Many streets, homes, and churches are over 100 years old. And for that reason, there are many old cemeteries here. I have always liked old places since childhood. However, I had no particular interest in cemeteries. I didn't believe in ghosts. At least, not until that night. The incident occurred during the last week of October. That day, I was working the night shift at a small local construction firm. Usually, my work wrapped up by 10:30 p.m. However, due to a delayed delivery that night, I had to stay until almost 11:30 p.m. On my way home, I noticed my car's GPS was directing me through a strange route. I was near the older district of Savannah. The road was very narrow, lined on both sides with massive, ancient trees. Suddenly, an alert popped up on my phone. There was an accident on the road ahead. The GPS instructed me to detour down an old side road. I followed that route. A few minutes later, I saw the iron gate of an old cemetery in front of my car. The gate was closed. However, a narrow lane passed right alongside it. I drove further down that lane. Then I realized the GPS had led me down the wrong path. The road came to a dead end. Ahead was nothing but a small parking patch. I tried to turn the car around to leave, but my rear wheels got stuck in deep mud. I tried several times. It didn't work. By then, it was nearly 12:40 a.m. I stepped out of the vehicle and turned on my phone's flashlight. Looking at the mud, I knew I couldn't get the car out alone, so I called roadside assistance. They estimated it would take about 40 minutes to arrive. I could have waited inside the car. However, shutting off the engine made the interior very cold. So after a while, I got out of the car and started walking around. In front of me was the cemetery. Through the iron gate, several rows of old graves were visible. I was standing right by the gate. Just then, I heard a sound. Thud. I raised my head. Again, thud. The sound was coming from inside the cemetery. At first, I thought a tree branch had fallen. Then the sound repeated. Thud, 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 as if someone was striking stone with a metallic object. I aimed my phone's flashlight through gaps in the gate. Nothing was visible. I reassured myself. Perhaps an animal, or an old metal object swinging in the wind. Then I noticed something. About 30 to 40 feet inside the gate stood a small iron bench, and standing beside that bench was a person. At first, I assumed it was a security guard. The person was wearing a black jacket, a baseball cap on his head. He was staring directly at me. I raised my hand and said, "Hey, everything okay?" The man didn't answer. After a moment, he simply asked, "Are you Daniel?" A cold shiver ran through my chest. I didn't know him. I replied, "Yeah, who are you?" He said nothing. He just kept staring at me. Then, in a very calm voice, he said, "You shouldn't be here this late." I said, "I know. My car got stuck." He shook his head and said, "Leave the car." I chuckled nervously. "Yeah, that's not really an option." The man now stepped closer toward the gate. That was when I noticed something strange. He was walking toward the gate, but his eyes were not on me. He kept glancing repeatedly toward the road, as if he wanted to ensure we were completely alone. I asked, "Are you a security guard?" He didn't reply. Instead, he said, "Go back to your car." His voice was firmer than before. I felt uneasy. I backed away. Just then, the headlights of an approaching car appeared in the distance. I thought roadside assistance had arrived. I looked toward the road. The light drew closer. However, the car didn't stop near the gate. It slowly drove past. The man was no longer standing by the gate. I shone my flashlight all around. Nobody was there. I thought perhaps he had walked toward the other side of the cemetery. Then my phone rang. I looked down at the screen. Roadside assistance. They informed me it would take another 15 minutes. I started walking back toward my car. However, halfway there, something odd happened. A notification popped up on my phone. No phone number, no contact name, just the text, "Don't walk through the cemetery." I froze. I was certain someone had sent this. But who? I looked around. There was no one. I resumed walking toward my car. Then I heard footsteps behind me. One set, then another. I stopped walking. The footsteps stopped too. I walked again. The footsteps resumed. I broke into a run. My car wasn't far away. However, right at that moment, my phone rang again. The screen displayed the same text. "Don't turn around." I stopped dead in my tracks because someone was standing directly behind me. I couldn't see him, but I could hear his breathing. Then came that voice, "Daniel." I closed my eyes. The man said, "You dropped something." I slowly looked down. My wallet was lying on the ground. I knew when it must have slipped from my pocket, but one thing made no sense. How did the man know my name? I didn't bend down to pick up the wallet. Instead, I sprinted. I reached my car and threw open the door. Right then, headlights appeared in the distance once more. Roadside assistance. I began shouting for help. The truck pulled up and stopped. A middle-aged driver stepped out. I explained everything to him. He stared at me for a few seconds and said, "There's nobody here." I replied, "I know what I saw." He looked toward the cemetery. Then he said, "Actually, I think you should see something." He grabbed a flashlight from the back of his vehicle. The two of us walked up to the gate. After searching for a moment, he pointed out a small surveillance camera. It was mounted right above the cemetery entrance. The next morning, the police arrived and reviewed the footage. I watched it myself. The video showed me standing near the gate at 12:52 a.m. Then, for about 3 minutes, I am seen talking to someone. I am repeatedly looking toward the inside of the gate. However, in the video, in front of me, there was no one, not a single person. I was standing there talking to thin air, except in the final few seconds of the footage, something becomes visible. Standing beside a row of graves inside the cemetery is a man, a black jacket, a baseball cap. He was staring directly into the camera. Police later stated they could not identify the individual. And the strangest part? That section of the cemetery was strictly off limits to the public. Furthermore, there was no record of anyone being authorized on the grounds at night. My wallet? I found it lying beside my car. Yeah, I could have sworn I saw it lie inside the cemetery perimeter. To this day, I still do not know what truly transpired. Perhaps my tired mind misidentified someone amidst the darkness and fear. Perhaps the shadow of a security camera, swaying tree branches, and an exhausted brain combined to create the illusion of a human figure. And the strange phone notification? The police suggested it might have been an automated text. However, one question remains unanswered to this day. If the man wasn't truly there, how did he know my name? Since that night, I have never entered another cemetery at night, because whether I believe in ghosts or not, that no longer matters. I only know that what you fear most in the dark isn't always real. But that doesn't mean there is no one standing behind you in the dark. Sarah, don't go near that grave. I stopped. The voice sounded just like my brother Marcus. The problem was, Marcus had passed away 3 years ago, and that voice came from right behind me. True horror vault. There are certain nights people remember for the rest of their lives, because during those nights, things occur that, even if clearly explained later, leave behind a terror that never fully dissipates. Today's story belongs to Sarah Mitchell. Location: an old cemetery on the outskirts of Boston, Massachusetts. Sarah didn't go there looking for ghosts. She went to visit the grave of a deceased relative. Then she encountered a person who might have simply been a criminal, or someone who had long been using that cemetery as his personal hideout. And the most terrifying part, by the time Sarah realized the truth, it was already far too late. Story 2. The Caretaker of the Cemetery. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I lived in the Quincy area of Massachusetts. The incident took place on a Friday night in November. That day was my mother's birthday. My mother had passed away several years prior. Her grave was located in an old family cemetery outside Boston. I usually visited during the day. However, I was delayed leaving the office that evening. It was nearly 10:30 p.m. I thought to myself, I would stand by my mother's grave for even just 5 minutes. The cemetery was small, enclosed by old stone walls. At the entrance hung a wooden sign. Cemetery closed after dark. I saw the sign. Still, I pulled my car over. I sat inside the vehicle for a moment. It was raining. Then I told myself, I won't stay longer than 5 minutes. I grabbed a flashlight and headed inside. The cemetery was eerily silent at night. Only the sound of rainfall, and occasionally the distant hum of a passing car. I walked up to my mother's grave and stood there. I placed some flowers down. I stood quietly for a moment. Then suddenly, a sound came from behind me. Crunch. The sound of footsteps on dry leaves. I turned around. No one was there. I assumed it was some small animal. However, a few seconds later, again, crunch. This time, the sound was much closer. I swung my flashlight beam around. In the distance stood the silhouette of a man, a male figure, a long jacket, a flashlight in his hand. He was watching me. I said, "Hi." He raised a hand and said, "Cemetery's closed." I replied, "I know. I'm leaving." The man slowly stepped toward me. "Who are you visiting?" I said, "My mother." He asked, "What's her name?" The question made me uncomfortable. I asked, "Why?" He said, "I'm the caretaker." I looked at him. There was no badge on his jacket, no company logo either. I asked, "Can I see some ID?" He smirked. "It's raining. Come on." Then he turned and began walking away. I didn't budge. He took a few steps, paused, and looked back over his shoulder. "Your car's outside, right?" I nodded. He said, "Don't leave through the main gate." Surprised, I asked, "Why?" He said, "Gate's locked." I realized immediately that something wasn't right. I had opened the gate myself to walk in. Why would it be locked now? I said, "I'll figure it out." The man said nothing more. He melted back into the darkness. Standing beside my mother's grave, I pulled out my phone. Cell signal was very weak. I thought about dialing 911. However, before I could, a notification flashed on screen. Motion detected. At first, I didn't understand. Then it clicked. My home security camera app was active on my phone. The notification was from my house camera. I dismissed it. Then another sound, this time to my left. I shone my flashlight over. A black plastic bag was lying beside an old mausoleum. I didn't approach it. However, beside the bag, I spotted fresh footprints in the mud. Someone had been standing there moments ago, and those footprints led directly toward my mother's grave. My heart sank into my stomach. I backed away. Right then, my phone rang. Unknown number. I didn't answer. 2 seconds later, a voicemail notification popped up. I opened the voicemail. I didn't want to hear it. However, I listened to it later. The voice was very faint. At first, it sounded like falling rain. Then, a man's voice saying, "She's not alone." I do not know who said those words. I do not know what that man truly wanted from me, and I do not know how he knew my name. However, one thing I know for certain, that night, as I stood beside my mother's grave, I was not alone, and that is precisely why I never visit any cemetery after nightfall anymore. Because the most terrifying thing in a cemetery isn't always beneath the graves. Sometimes it stands right among them. As I was passing the last row of the cemetery, I spotted a flashlight beam in the distance. A man was standing there. I shouted out, "Hey, are you okay?" The man didn't reply. Then he slowly turned the light toward me, and I realized he wasn't holding a flashlight at all. The light was emanating from behind him. People's greatest fears regarding cemeteries usually revolve around the dead. However, in real life, terror sometimes comes from the living. Today's story is of that nature. There are no paranormal entities here, no impossible phenomena, just an old cemetery, a dark night, an ordinary person, and questions whose answers he still doesn't fully know to this day. This is Marcus Reed's story. Location, an old family cemetery outside Portland, Oregon. Time, early winter. And according to Marcus, the mistake he made that night was stopping to help a stranger. No words, just several seconds of heavy breathing. Then, in a very low whisper, someone said, "Sarah." I froze solid. My name. I lowered my phone. Was someone playing a sick prank on me? Was someone following me? I began walking quickly toward the main gate. However, the gate was indeed shut tight. I pulled on it. It wouldn't budge. That was when I knew the man hadn't been lying. I looked around me. Rows of headstones. Rainfall. Darkness. And not a soul in sight. Beside the gate, I noticed a small maintenance building. The door was ajar. A light was burning inside. I thought perhaps the caretaker was in there. I walked up to the door and called out, "Hello." No response. I stepped inside. The room was tiny. An old desk, keys hanging on the wall, and a monitor screen. The monitor displayed several live camera feeds from around the cemetery. I looked at my own feed. A camera was showing my position. Then I noticed something horrifying. One camera was pointed directly at my mother's grave, and on the live camera footage, I saw a man standing right next to my mother's grave. I spun around immediately and looked outside. Nobody was there. I looked back at the monitor. The man on screen was now staring directly into the camera. Then he stepped toward the lens. The video feed suddenly went black. That was when I realized the man who claimed to be the caretaker had been inside this building. Where was he right now? I bolted for the door. Right at that moment, I heard a car engine start outside. I peered out the window. A white van was parked on one side of the cemetery grounds. Its headlights flickered on. I tried to read the license plate. However, the heavy rain obscured my view. Then the van door opened. The man stepped out. He stared directly at the maintenance building. I immediately killed the lights inside and ducked under the desk. The front door opened. The man walked in. The sound of his boots slowly approached. I held my breath in absolute terror. He stopped right beside the desk. A few seconds of dead silence. Then he whispered, "Sarah." I squeezed my eyes shut. He knew my name. That was when I realized he was hunting for me. Suddenly, a car horn blared outside. The man froze. Then he quickly turned and rushed back out. I waited a few seconds before stepping out. A police cruiser was parked outside. I later learned that before I even dialed 911, an emergency dispatcher had picked up my phone's location ping. 2 officers escorted me safely off the grounds. However, the man was gone. The van had vanished as well. Over the next few hours, police searched the entire cemetery. Inside the maintenance building, they uncovered several items that proved this was no simple misunderstanding. There was a notebook containing the names of several deceased individuals, dates, grave locations, and short scribbled notes beside each entry. Nobody knew why those details had been logged. Police also confirmed that the individual was not a registered cemetery caretaker. Instead, he had been breaking into the maintenance building for months. For what purpose? That was never definitively determined. However, upon reviewing security footage, police discovered he visited the cemetery on numerous nights, sometimes staying for hours at a time, sometimes sitting quietly beside graves, and other times simply watching people's parked vehicles. Police suspected he was using the cemetery grounds as a base for theft or other criminal activities. However, he was never found. The fresh footprints found beside my mother's grave were never definitively explained either. Yet to me, the most terrifying detail was something else. A few weeks later, I received a call from the police department. They told me they had reanalyzed my voicemail recording from that night. They asked me, "Did you know anyone named Marcus?" I said, "No." They then informed me that faint background audio was picked up on the recording,